Garrett adjusted his tie, exhaling slowly as he stepped into the wedding reception alone. He hadn't planned on coming by himself, but his plus one, his best friend's girlfriend's cousin, or something like that, had backed out at the last minute. And now, here he was, a single man at a wedding, dodging pitying looks from married couples and well-meaning relatives who'd probably try to set him up before the night was over. He scanned the room, searching for the table number on his place card. Table 7. He wove through the elegantly decorated ballroom, dodging a waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes until he found his seat, except someone was already sitting there, a woman. She had long, wavy brown hair that cascaded over her shoulder, and she was studying the place card in front of her with a furrowed brow. As he approached, she looked up, her brown eyes catching his with a flicker of confusion. I think there's been a mistake," she said, holding up her card. "This says table 7, seat 4. Garrett glanced down at his own place card, table 7, seat 4, his lips parted slightly. That's weird, really weird." She tilted her head, studying him. Then she let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Well, I guess one of us is in the wrong place," Garrett smirked, "unless this is some kind of elaborate matchmaking attempt by the bride and groom." She laughed again, and something about the sound of it made his chest feel lighter. "I'm Charlotte, by the way," she said, offering her hand. "Garrett." He shook her hand, noticing how warm and soft her skin was. A waiter passed by and Charlotte grabbed her glass of champagne, taking a sip before glancing around the room. "You here alone?" "Yeah," he admitted. "You?" She hesitated for just a second before nodding. "Yeah, my best friend is the bride, so I kind of had to be here, but my plus one." She rolled her eyes. "Let's just say he didn't make it." Garrett raised a brow. "Flaked on you. You could say that." There was something in her tone, something guarded, but before he could ask, the music shifted, signaling the start of the speeches. They both turned their chairs toward the stage, but Garrett found himself stealing glances at Charlotte throughout the evening. She was effortlessly beautiful, but there was something else, something in the way she bit her lip when she tried not to laugh, or how her eyes softened when the bride and groom exchanged their vows. After dinner, the dance floor filled with couples swaying to the music, and Garrett noticed Charlotte tapping her fingers against the table in time with the beat. "You want to dance?" He asked suddenly, surprising even himself. Charlotte blinked up at him. "What?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "I mean, we both got stuck at the same seat. Might as well take advantage of fate, right?" She stared at him for a beat, then smiled. "You make a compelling argument." A spark of something electric shot through him as she placed her hand in his. He led her onto the dance floor, resting one hand on her waist as she placed hers on his shoulder. The moment they started moving, something shifted. The room, the music, the guests around them, it all faded. It was just them. Garrett wasn't the kind of guy who believed in serendipity. But standing there with Charlotte, her body inches from his, her eyes locked onto his like he was the only man in the room. He wondered if maybe, just this once, fate had a hand in things. Charlotte exhaled softly, her gaze flickering to his lips for just a moment before she looked away. And just like that, the moment was gone. The song ended and she pulled back slightly, clearing her throat. "I should probably—" "Yeah, of course," Garrett said quickly, dropping his hand from her waist. She hesitated, then smiled. "Thanks for the dance, though." "Anytime." She turned to walk away, but something inside him told him he couldn't just let her go. "Charlotte," she paused, looking over her shoulder. "Would you want to?" Before he could finish, a man appeared at her side. "Hey, there you are." Charlotte stiffened. Garrett's stomach twisted. The guy, tall, broad, with an easy smirk, slipped an arm around Charlotte's waist. "You ready to go?" he asked her. Charlotte's smile faltered. Yeah, sure." She looked at Garrett, and for a split second he thought he saw something in her eyes. Regret. But then she nodded. "It was nice meeting you, Garrett." And just like that, she was gone. Garrett stood there, watching as she walked away with the other guy, something heavy settling in his chest. Maybe fate had brought them together, but just as quickly it had taken her away. Garrett hadn't expected to think about Charlotte after that night. Yet here he was, a week later, replaying every moment of their encounter like a song stuck in his head. The way her laughter had felt like sunlight breaking through a storm. The way her body had instinctively molded against his when they danced, as if they'd done it 100 times before. And the way she'd left, with him. Garrett didn't know who the guy was, but the stiffness in Charlotte's posture when he appeared hadn't gone unnoticed. There had been something in her eyes, something that didn't quite match the easy smile she'd put on. But it wasn't his place to dwell on it, or at least, that's what he told himself. It wasn't until he ran into his friend, Luke, one of the groomsmen from the wedding, that Charlotte's name surfaced again. Crazy how weddings bring people together, huh? Luke mused, sipping his beer. They were at a local bar, catching up when the conversation shifted. Heard a couple of people met someone that night. Garrett arched a brow. Oh yeah. Yeah. Actually, the bride was telling me about this mix-up with the seating chart. Some mistake that put two strangers at the same table. Garrett's stomach tightened. Huh, Luke smirked. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Garrett exhaled, shaking his head. It was unexpected. Luke leaned back, studying him. So what happened? Not much. We talked, danced, and then she left. Luke frowned. With who? Garrett hesitated. Some guy. Luke's expression shifted. Ah. He didn't elaborate, but the way he said it made something in Garrett's chest stir. What does "ah" mean? Luke sighed, setting his drink down. That was probably Daniel. Daniel. Her fiancé. The word hit like a punch to the ribs. Garrett sat back, gripping his glass a little tighter. She's engaged, Luke nodded. Yeah, it's complicated. Garrett almost laughed at the irony. How so? He asked, even though he knew he shouldn't. Luke hesitated, then leaned in a little. They've been together forever. High school sweethearts, the whole deal. But from what I've heard, things between them aren't great. There were rumors about them breaking up a while back, but I guess they worked it out. Garrett wasn't sure why that information made his pulse quicken. Why are you telling me this? Luke gave him a look. Because I saw the way you were looking at her when you thought no one was paying attention. Garrett didn't respond, because what could he say? That he'd felt something in the span of one night that he couldn't shake. That he'd met a woman who had made everything else in the room disappear. It was ridiculous. And yet. She's engaged, Garrett said finally, as if saying it out loud would make it easier to accept. Luke nodded. Yeah, she is. But there was something unspoken in his tone, something that made Garrett wonder if an engagement was the same as being in love. 2 weeks passed, and then Garrett saw her again. It was completely unexpected. He had stopped by a small cafe to grab coffee before work, when he spotted her sitting by the window, stirring a cup of tea absent-mindedly. For a moment, he considered walking away, but then, as if sensing him, she looked up. Their eyes met. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by something else, something unreadable. Before he could think better of it, his feet moved. Charlotte, she blinked, as if unsure he was real, then, slowly, a small smile curved her lips. Garrett, he hesitated. Mind if I sit? She hesitated too, and then, with a breath, she nodded. Of all the places, she mused as he lowered himself into the chair across from her. Yeah, he agreed. Guess fate really likes messing with us. She laughed softly, but there was something different about her this time, a quietness, a weight. He noticed the absence of a ring on her finger. His gaze flickered to hers, but he didn't ask. Instead, he leaned back. How have you been? Charlotte exhaled. That's a loaded question. Garrett gave her a look. I have time. She studied him for a moment, then glanced down at her tea. I left him, she said finally. Garrett's breath caught. She sighed, tracing the rim of her cup. It wasn't working. It hadn't been for a long time, and I think, deep down, I knew it. But it's hard to walk away from something when you've spent years convincing yourself it's supposed to last forever. Garrett didn't say anything, he just listened. She smiled faintly. The night of the wedding, I think I knew then too, I just wasn't ready to admit it. Something in his chest tightened. I wanted to stay, she admitted, so softly he almost didn't hear it. I wanted to dance with you longer. I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't leave. Garrett swallowed. Why didn't you? She inhaled sharply, shaking her head. Because I was scared. A moment passed between them, thick with words unspoken, and then, finally, she looked up at him, her brown eyes searching his. But I'm not scared anymore. Garrett's pulse thundered. Charlotte exhaled, then smiled, a little tentative, a little hopeful. Would you want to dance with me again? She asked. Garrett didn't hesitate. Yeah, he said, voice steady, I would. And just like that, the weight in his chest lifted. The air between them crackled with something unspoken, something fragile but electric. Garrett wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew he wasn't going to let Charlotte slip away again. They left the cafe together, stepping out into the crisp evening air. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and lavender. Charlotte wrapped her arms around herself, and without thinking, Garrett shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She glanced up at him, surprised. Chivalry isn't dead, huh? He smirked. Not as long as I'm around. A soft chuckle escaped her lips, but it faded quickly. She hesitated, as if debating something before finally speaking. I don't really know what I'm doing, she admitted. Garrett turned to face her fully. What do you mean? She exhaled, looking down at her hands. I just ended a long relationship. I'm trying to figure out who I am outside of that, and the last thing I want to do is hurt anyone. Understanding settled over him. She was afraid of stepping into something new too quickly, of making the wrong choice before she even knew what she wanted. He nodded slowly. I get that. Her eyes flickered to his. You do? Yeah, he said honestly. You need time to breathe, to be yourself without expectations. She studied him, as if searching for the catch. You're not mad, Garrett shook his head. Charlotte, the last thing I want is to rush this. Whatever this is. If you need time, take it. I'm not going anywhere. Something in her expression softened, like she hadn't expected him to say that. You're kind of incredible, you know that, she murmured. He grinned. I do, actually. But it's nice to hear it from someone else. She laughed, really laughed, and the sound filled something in him he hadn't realized was empty. They walked for a while, side by side, both lost in their own thoughts. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was warm, easy. Every now and then, their hands would brush, and Garrett would feel a jolt of awareness shoot through him. Eventually, they reached a small park tucked away from the noise of the city. The sound of a distant street musician's violin drifted through the air, and Charlotte smiled. Do you hear that? She asked. Garrett nodded. Yeah, she turned to him, eyes shining with something playful, something free. Dance with me, he blinked. Here, she nodded, stepping closer. Why not? He hesitated for half a second before shaking his head with a grin. All right, let's do it. She placed her hands on his shoulders, and he wrapped his arms around her waist. They swayed to the music, slow and unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. Charlotte rested her head against his chest, and Garrett closed his eyes for a moment, breathing her in. This feels nice, she whispered. His arms tightened around her slightly. Yeah. It does. They stayed like that until the song ended, until the streetlights flickered to life and the world around them grew quiet. Charlotte pulled back just enough to look up at him. There was something different in her gaze now, something certain. And then, before he could say anything, she rose onto her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as if she was testing the waters. But when Garrett responded, when he slid his hand up to cup her cheek and deepen the kiss, she melted against him. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't desperate, it was just them. When they finally pulled apart, she exhaled shakily, her forehead resting against his. I don't know what this is yet, she murmured. But I want to find out. Garrett's heart pounded. Me too, he said. And for the first time in a long time, everything felt exactly right. Garrett had never been a man to believe in fate. But as he stood there in the quiet of the evening, Charlotte still in his arms, her breath warm against his skin, he realized something deep in his chest had shifted. She was here. And she had chosen to be. They walked slowly back toward the main road, neither of them in a hurry to part ways. Charlotte's fingers brushed against his, hesitant, unsure, until finally, Garrett took the initiative and laced their hands together. She didn't pull away. If anything, her grip tightened. "I don't think I've ever done anything like this before," she admitted after a moment. Garrett glanced at her. "Like what?" She chewed her lip. "Let myself feel something this soon after a breakup." He squeezed her hand gently. "Does it feel wrong?" Charlotte shook her head, her gaze flickering up to meet his. "No, that's the strange part." "It doesn't." A comfortable silence settled between them, the city lights reflecting in her deep brown eyes. Garrett wanted to ask her 1,000 things, to know everything about her, from her favorite book to her biggest regret. But he knew better than to rush. They reached her apartment building, and Charlotte hesitated at the entrance, turning to face him. "This is me," she said softly. Garrett nodded, not quite ready to let go. Charlotte exhaled, like she was trying to find the right words. "I meant it when I said I don't know what this is yet. I don't want to rush into something just because it feels good in the moment." He studied her, searching for any sign of doubt, but all he saw was sincerity. "I don't want something fleeting, Charlotte," he said, his voice steady. "I want something real. And if that means taking things slow, I'll wait." Something flickered across her face, relief, gratitude, maybe even something deeper. She reached up, brushing her fingers along his jaw before leaning in, pressing the softest of kisses to his cheek. "Good night, Garrett." He watched her disappear inside, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Days passed, and what started as something tentative quickly became something undeniable. They met for coffee in the mornings, stealing quiet moments before the day swept them away. They took evening walks through the city, their conversations stretching late into the night. Garrett learned that Charlotte hated olives but loved the smell of bookstores. That she hummed under her breath when she was lost in thought. That she had always wanted to learn how to paint but never found the time. And Charlotte learned that Garrett had a habit of running his fingers through his hair when he was frustrated. That he drank his coffee black, but put way too much sugar in his tea. That he had lost his dad when he was 16, and even now, some days were harder than others. It was easy being with her, too easy, and that's what scared him. Because things that felt too good never lasted. One evening, as they sat on a park bench sharing a carton of takeout, Charlotte grew quiet. Garrett noticed immediately. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, twirling a loose strand of hair around her finger. "Daniel called me today." His stomach clenched, but he forced his expression to remain neutral. "Oh," she nodded. "He wanted to talk. He said he regrets how things ended, that he thinks we made a mistake." Garrett stared at her, his pulse a dull roar in his ears. "And what do you think?" Charlotte exhaled slowly. I spent a long time convincing myself that love was supposed to be difficult. That if it wasn't constantly being fought for, it wasn't real." Garrett swallowed hard. "And now," she turned to him, her gaze steady. "Now I think love isn't supposed to feel like drowning." His breath caught. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "It's supposed to feel like this." Garrett didn't realize how much he had been holding his breath until that moment. Charlotte wasn't second-guessing them. She wasn't looking back. She was choosing him. He lifted their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Then let's keep going," he murmured. She smiled, and in that moment he knew this wasn't fleeting. This was real. Garrett had never been the type to overthink things. He lived in the present, made decisions based on instinct, and rarely second-guessed himself. But with Charlotte, everything felt different. Every glance, every touch, every moment between them carried a weight he couldn't ignore. And now, as he stood outside her apartment, waiting for her to answer the door, that weight pressed down on him more than ever. She opened the door, her hair slightly damp, wearing an oversized sweater that slipped off one shoulder. The sight of her like this, comfortable, unguarded, sent a rush of warmth through him. "Hey," she said, her voice soft, her smile easy. "Hey," he echoed. She stepped aside, letting him in, and he followed her into the cozy warmth of her home. The scent of vanilla lingered in the air, mixing with the faintest trace of paint. She'd finally bought a set of brushes and canvases, and he'd been there when she timidly dipped her brush into color for the first time. Garrett sat on the couch, watching as she curled up beside him, tucking her legs beneath her. She rested her head against his shoulder, and the simple act sent his heart into overdrive. They had fallen into something effortless, something that felt like it had always existed between them, even before they knew each other. But for all the ease, there was still an undercurrent of something unspoken. He cleared his throat. "Charlotte," she hummed in response, but when he didn't continue, she lifted her head to look at him. "What is it?" Garrett hesitated. He wasn't sure how to phrase what he felt, wasn't sure if he even had the right to bring it up, but the words came anyway. "I don't want to be something you use to move on." Her brows pulled together, confusion flashing in her eyes. "Garrett, I know you said you're not looking back," he interrupted gently. "And I believe you, but I also know how hard it is to walk away from something that's been part of your life for so long." Charlotte sat up fully, turning to face him. "You think this is just me trying to fill a void," he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, and that's the problem. I don't want to wonder. I don't want to feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop." The room fell quiet. Then Charlotte reached for his hand, holding it tightly between both of hers. "Garrett," she said, her voice steady, her eyes searching his. "You are not a replacement. You are not something temporary." His chest tightened. "I know what I walked away from," she continued. "And I know what I'm walking toward. And if you think for a second that I don't see the difference between the two, you don't know me as well as I thought you did." Garrett let out a slow breath, her words sinking deep into him, unraveling the doubts that had been gnawing at the edges of his mind. She squeezed his hand. "I don't want to waste time pretending I don't feel what I feel, and I don't want you doubting it either." The intensity in her gaze left no room for question. Garrett shifted, tilting her chin up so she couldn't look anywhere but at him. "You know you drive me crazy, right?" A small smile danced across her lips. "I'd be disappointed if I didn't." He chuckled, but the laughter faded as he leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. "This is real for me," he murmured. Charlotte exhaled shakily. "Me too." And then he kissed her. There was no hesitation this time, no uncertainty. Just the overwhelming certainty that this was exactly where he was meant to be. She melted into him, fingers threading through his hair, pulling him closer. His hands slid around her waist, anchoring her against him. And in that moment, he knew this wasn't just something fleeting. This was something worth holding on to. Garrett never thought love could feel like this, like certainty, like gravity. Like something that had always been waiting for him, just out of reach, until now. Charlotte was in his arms, her lips warm against his, her heartbeat a steady rhythm against his chest. And as he kissed her, he knew this was it. This was the moment everything changed. When they finally pulled apart, she let out a soft breath, her fingers still tangled in his hair. Her eyes searched his, and for the first time since they met, there was no hesitation, no doubt, just quiet acceptance of what they were. "I love you," Garrett said, the words slipping from his lips before he could stop them. But he didn't want to stop them. He didn't want to hold anything back. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting in surprise. For a second, he worried he had said it too soon, that maybe she wasn't ready. But then, a slow, breathtaking smile spread across her face. "You do," she whispered. He cupped her face, brushing his thumb along her cheek. "Yeah. I do." Something in her expression cracked, like a wall finally shattering. And then, before he could say anything else, she kissed him again, fiercely, desperately, like she had been waiting to hear those words her entire life. When she pulled back, her hands trembled slightly against his chest. "Garrett," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. He held his breath. "I love you too." His heart nearly stopped. Charlotte let out a soft, nervous laugh, shaking her head like she couldn't believe it herself. "I didn't think I'd be able to say that again, not after everything, but with you." She swallowed hard. It's different. It's real. Garrett's arms tightened around her, pulling her close. It's real for me too. She exhaled against his neck, her body relaxing into his. And in that moment, everything else, her past, his fears, the uncertainty of the future faded away. Because this was all that mattered. They spent the next few weeks wrapped up in each other, moving through life as if they had always been together. Late-night walks turned into lazy mornings tangled in sheets. Coffee runs became inside jokes and lingering touches. Every moment, every glance, every whisper felt like a promise one neither of them intended to break. One evening, Garrett took Charlotte to the rooftop of his apartment building, a place he often went to clear his head. The city stretched out below them, lights flickering like stars against the darkened skyline. Charlotte leaned against the railing, her hair blowing in the gentle breeze. "It's beautiful up here." Garrett watched her, knowing he would never find anything more beautiful than the way she looked in this moment. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. She turned, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Oh," he pulled out a small, folded piece of paper and handed it to her. She opened it carefully, her brow furrowing as she read the handwritten words. "You once told me love shouldn't feel like drowning. With you, it feels like breathing." Her breath hitched. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Garrett." He took a step closer, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I meant every word." Charlotte let out a shaky laugh, clutching the paper to her chest. "No one's ever written something like this for me before." Garrett smiled. "Then I guess I'll just have to keep writing them." She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his neck. "I love you," she whispered. He closed his eyes, holding her tightly. "I love you too." And as they stood there, wrapped in each other, the city below them humming with life, Garrett knew this wasn't just love. This was forever.